So today we're going to look at evaluating expressions. So you have to do order of operations as well. So here we have an absolute value. And remember, absolute value is the distance from 0. But because there is an operation inside the absolute value, you must do that operation first before you can actually take the absolute value. So absolute value is not a parentheses, but you still have to do what's inside the absolute value first. So what is 6 negative 6 plus a negative 2? Right? Don't you have 6 negatives and you're adding 2 more negatives? So don't you just have a bunch of negatives? So negative 6 plus negative 2 gives you a negative 8 inside the absolute value. So you must have your absolute value bars there because we have not done that operation yet. Now we can take the absolute value of negative 8. So how far is negative 8 from 0? 8 units. And that's what your work should look like. Number 2, remember if you have a number next to an operation and there is no addition or subtraction, multiplication, division, remember that implies that you're multiplying. So you read this, negative 4 times the absolute value of 3. That's how you'd read that. So because the negative 4 is outside the absolute value, we have to take the absolute value of 3 first. So how far is 3 from 0? 3 units. Then we can multiply. And that's what your work should look like. For number 3, notice that the subtraction is in between two different absolute values. And we do not have, right? We do not have any operations inside the absolute value. So notice this is between the two absolute values. So we have to take the absolute value of negative 7. How far is negative 7 from 0? 7 units. How far is positive 9 from 0? 9 units. And then we can do the subtraction. And remember, we talked about subtraction. So 7 take away 9. It's easier to change subtraction to addition as long as you change the next number to its opposite. So the opposite of positive 9 is negative 9. So we have 7 positives, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 positives, and 9 negatives. So I think that's 7 positive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9 negatives. And remember, a positive with a negative is a 0. So doesn't that leave us a negative 2 as our final answer? Right? Another way of looking at it is, don't we have more negatives, right? Don't we have more negatives than we do positives? How many more negatives do we have? We have 2 more negatives than we do positives. So that's what your work should look like. So let's look at the next set. So this time we have variable expressions. So we have letters. Remember, letters are variables and they are placeholders. When you have a number next to a variable where there's nothing there, remember that means to multiply. So the first step that I want to see on your paper is I want to see the substitution step. And the substitution step, remember, is that we are not doing any math. We're just rewriting the sentence, taking out the letters and replacing them with what they said to replace them. So it's asking you to replace B with negative 5, and then we're going to replace A with negative 3. Make sure you're replacing things correctly. So the first step I should see on your paper is negative 2, right? And then we should always put the base in parentheses, right? And then B is negative 5. And A, since A is a negative, we're going to put that in parentheses too. So we're going to put A in parentheses as well. So and then that's the first step. If we didn't put this in parentheses, you didn't really have to. You could write negative 3 like that. but then you've got the plus sign and the negative sign really close to each other. So a lot of times when you have an addition sign or a subtraction sign, and then you're substituting another negative, we like to emphasize. So that's how everybody's first step should look like. And then we're going to do order of operations. According to PEMDAS, right, shouldn't we do the exponent first? So what is negative 5 squared? Remember, that's how you read it. Negative 5 squared, remember, means a negative 5 times another negative 5. So a negative times a negative, that would be positive 25. So we have negative 2. Remember, this means multiply, so I'm going to multiply. And then negative 5 squared is positive 25. Then don't we have to multiply next? So a negative 2 times a positive 25 is a negative 50. Right? When the signs are different, when you're multiplying to negatives, you have to really know your sign rules, and you're adding and subtracting. So we are adding a negative 50 plus a negative 3. So don't we have 50 negatives? I mean, we're certainly not going to write 50 negatives. And then 3 more negatives. So don't we just have a bunch of negatives? We're certainly not going to write all those out. So negative 53 is your final answer. And that's what your work should look like. Let's try number 5. Remember, this symbol is the square root symbol. Make sure when you're copying it, you don't shorten it. So when you're copying it, you don't do this because that's something different. The square root goes all the way to the end of 6, so when you want to make sure that you go all the way out, that's super important because it could mean something different. So we are going to first replace and recopy, and we're going to replace the x with 30. So the step 1 is just to do the substitution. So I'm going to emphasize just step 1 is to substitute. So when you substitute, you should have the square root symbol, and then 30 plus 6. Make sure that your square root goes all the way to the end. See, that would be incorrect if you just got sloppy and didn't go all the way to the end. So you got to go all the way to the end. So order of operations says we have to do the operation under the square root first. So we're adding, so we actually have to do the 30 plus 6 under the square root, which is 36. Then we can take the square root of 36, which is 6. So that's what your work should look like. Remember, you can go back, you can stop these, and you can try these on your own first and then see how you did. So that's a way to learn from a video. Say, I'm going to try this problem, and then I'll play it and see if I'm doing it right. So notice this time the square root only goes out to just the x. It doesn't go all the way across. So really important to acknowledge where the symbols end and start. So step 1 is just to substitute. We're not doing any math in step 1. Super important skill that we can rewrite an expression and then just replace everything and rewrite all the symbols correctly. So that's the expectation, is that I will see that step on your paper. And then we do order of operations. We got to do the square root of 9 first, because the plus sign, right? The plus sign is outside the square root. So we have to do the square root of 9 first, and the square root of 9 is 3, then we can add the 5. So that's what your steps should look like. Number 7. Notice the negative is outside of the squaring. So we have the squaring, it's outside. So when you replace, remember this is called your base. So this is your base, and this is your exponent or your power. When you are substituting in for a base, you need to have a parentheses around just the base. So when you're doing step 1 and you're substituting, you need the negative, there's where x used to be, and that x is being squared, plus then there's another x. So we have to put 3 into both of these x's. And whenever you have a base, you must put it in parentheses. So this is where the x used to be, right? So we need to put 3 where that x used to be. And we have to have a parentheses around that. And then x, since x is not negative, I don't need to put another parentheses there. So that's what your first step should look like. And then order of operations. So this is basically saying -1 times 3 squared plus 3. That's what that is saying. So this is really -1 times. So order of operations says we have to do the exponent first. So -1 times, and then remember 3 squared. 3 squared means 3 times another 3, which is 9. Be careful, it's not 3 times 2. It's 3 times 3, which is 9, and then recopy. Order of operations says then you must multiply before you add. So a -1 times 9 is a -9. And then 9 negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 negatives, and 3 positives. Collect your zeros. That leaves me 6 negatives. So that's -6. So if you don't want to do the little tiles on paper, if you can see it in your head, don't we have more negatives than we do positives? Right? Don't we have more negatives than we do positives? How many more negatives do we have than positives? We have 6 more negatives than positives. So you really have to know how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide positive, negative numbers so that you can do more advanced math. Last slide. So here we have a similar problem that we just left, but notice this time we're going to be plugging in a -4 where the x's are. So remember, what did I say? When you have a base and you're going to substitute a number for a base, you must have a parentheses around just that base. Don't forget that there's a negative out in front of that. So when we do step 1 and we're just recopying and substituting, that's called substitution. I'm going to recopy that negative. There's where the base, and then the exponent, and then plus. So we're going to put in a -4 where the x's are. So I could do that. But to keep those two separated, I'm just going to emphasize. So that's what your work should look like on that problem. And then remember, this is like a -1 times. We have to do the exponent first. So remember, -4 squared means a -4 times another -4. And that is positive 16. So it's -1 times, sorry, that's my dog breathing hard, 16. That's Robin. He's a big newfie. And then you have to do multiplication. So -1 times 16 is a -16. And then if I have 16 negatives plus 4 more negatives, doesn't that give me a -20 as my final answer? Okay, I'm going to erase that so it gets it out of the way because that's kind of in the way of the next problem. So the last problem we're going to do, remember this means 3 times A. And we're going to substitute where there's an A, we're going to substitute -8. And where there's a B, we're going to substitute -2. So the very first step is the, what did I call it? The substitution step. We're just going to recopy. Now you can either use a dot to show that, or you can use a parentheses to show multiplication, right? I like to use the parentheses, and then division. Remember, this is division. And then we have a -4 plus a negative 2. So that's what your first step should look like. So let's evaluate the numerator. Do you know what the numerator is? Yeah, it's the top expression is the numerator. So what is 3 times negative 8? 3 times negative 8 is negative 24. Make sure your negative signs are nice and big. And then we're going to also, at the same time, we're going to evaluate the denominator. So what is a negative 4 plus a negative 2? Isn't that 4 negatives, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 more negatives. Isn't that just a bunch of negatives? So isn't that negative 6? And then remember, this is just a number fact. This just means negative 4 divided by negative 26. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. And then what is 24 divided by 6? Isn't that 4? So negative 24 divided by negative 6. So just think of 24 divided by 6. So think of 24 divided by 6. And then because you have the same sign, that's why it's going to be a positive 4. And usually when it's a positive answer, we just write our answer is 4. Got to really watch those sign errors. So go back and re-watch the video and practice doing the problems, and then see how you did if you want to.